election cycle, especially over the last 10 years, we've been hearing the same message. This is the most important election of our lifetime. I'm sick of that. We're also hearing we can't afford to lose. Vote blue no matter who. But what happens after we do that? Specifically as two Black women having this conversation, two Black women who are part of a demographic that consistently votes blue no matter who, we are not getting any return on that investment. What happens when the party that we keep backing in the name of harm reduction is not actually reducing any harm?
Yeah, and I think that's what's frustrating for a lot of people. I remember after the 2016 election where, I was going around talking to many people in the community who felt like nothing in their lives had tangibly changed over the last few years. And I think that's what many Americans feel like even right now, which is why a lot of people didn't show up to the polls, right? We had a lot of people who voted and Donald Trump did win. But there was millions of people who did not show up either, right? And it's because a lot of them feel disappointed by the party. And it's a prime example that if we don't start reimagining what the world could look like and how our representatives should be and could be, we're going to continue to see individuals who are who are saddling the line between not wanting to upset the Republicans, but also not fully showing up for the party that elected them.
And that's mind-blowing to me because Republicans do not care about upsetting us. So why are we so concerned about making them feel super happy? And I just feel like we're just playing the wrong game, right? Like it's very confusing and exhausting to see Democrats come up with, well, we just don't have the votes to really push on this, issue right now. We just don't have the power. Like Republicans will use whatever slim margin of a win they have to push everything through whenever they get the chance, using all the executive orders at their behest, using every single Republican vote to block Democrats or to push legislation through. And it's like, at what point are we going to push a strategy through? It's especially frustrating when you realize that this strategy of vote blue no matter who is really built on fear. It's like you make Democrats so worried that what happens if Trump wins, so worried about losing their basic rights, so worried about this political catastrophe that we don't have the time to look up and say, wait a second, if all I'm ever doing is keeping Republicans at bay, are we ever building our own strategy forward? And you said this earlier, Jamira, you were talking about how we need to get off of the defense and back to offense. We've been on defense for a really long time, so long that we wouldn't even know what to do if we really won. If we had 3 branches of government tomorrow, what strategy and agenda are Democrats pushing through other than being the anti-Trump? Like at some point we have to have our own vision that we're excited about, because fear does not build power. It keeps us playing defense instead of getting into a space and demanding better.
And realistically, we should have had a plan for reimagining, or a plan for, dealing with each of the realities, right? The slow response that we're seeing so much of the party to the policies and practices that are coming down from the administration is a response to the fact that they didn't think they were going to lose, right? They didn't think that they were going to lose. And they didn't think it would be this bad. Yet they told us that this would be the most important election of our time, that he was problematic to the safety and to the future of the American democracy. And so as someone who is a millennial, and the first time I got to vote for president, it was for a Black man and a white woman. President Joe Biden, not President Joe Biden, he's not Black, President Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, who both ran for president, the first time that I, as a Black woman, was able to vote for president. And to your point, every election feels like feels like an extreme crisis that we're constantly having to tackle. And at no point do any of us truly get to live, because we're constantly told we're moving from one crisis to the next crisis and the next crisis. And it's a lack of vision coming from our party that needs to move beyond just getting people into office, but also having a plan for what could the world look like if all of us was free? What could the world look like if women didn't constantly have to barter for the rights to their own body? What would happen if immigrants didn't have to worry about ICE knocking on their door or showing up to their school, their children's schoolroom?
Yeah.
None of that ever, I feel like, is truly discussed in a way that makes any of us feel whole or any of us feel hopeful.
Yeah, 1,000,000%. There's no dreaming happening right now. And so when the left does dream, it's like moderates within the Democratic Party are like, oh, that's illegitimate. That's pie in the sky. And it's like, I for one, would love to see a little pie in the sky something. Give me something that I'm like, that's just crazy enough for me to want to see what even shoot for the stars and shoot for the moon. And even if you don't make it, at least you're among the stars. Like, let's say you tell me you're going to get complete student debt cancellation, universal health care, and you're going to legalize marijuana. Okay, I want to see what getting 1 out of the 3 looks like. Like, I'll take part of the way there. But right now, it just feels like the ones holding all of the power in the Democratic Party are just afraid to admit that they don't know what they're doing. And they would rather follow the playbook that they've been playing, even though it has not won in over a decade. Let's be real, because President Barack Obama won on a very different strategy. And a lot of the kingmakers in the Democratic Party did not think he was going to win and were not backing him until they felt like, oh my God, this tidal wave of energy is too big to ignore. Mm-hmm. We've been avoiding atypical strategies, but atypical strategies have what's been winning the Republican Party their gains. No one saw Donald Trump coming in a legitimate way, and yet here he is on his second term. We have to stop acting so shocked when populism wins. And so we have to start following the lead of young people and Black voters and working class communities and before they get fully disengaged.
Yeah. And that's it. There's both populism, but also there's hate, right? At the underbelly of America, there is hate. Yeah. The vast majority of people who are frustrated with the Trump administration right now, who voted for him, are people who did not think that it would impact them. They were perfectly okay with other people experiencing harm, perfectly okay with other people losing their rights. But the moment that it impacted them, then all of a sudden they have a discrepancy that they want to pose to this administration. And I think until Democrats be honest with themselves, even Vice President Kamala Harris at one point during the administration said that America, it was something to the extent of America is not racist. And I was like, America is not racist is the reason why you lost, in part. Is the belief that you as a Black woman did not have the chops to be president. The belief that you as a woman did not have the chops to be president. And I think admitting the reality of this country doesn't necessarily mean you don't want to see it be better, that you don't want to see it thrive, that you don't have aspirations for it to be better. But it is a reckoning of the true history of this country that allows us to not have to repeat it again.
Yeah, 1,000,000%. She also got on The View and was asked, what would you do differently that Joe Biden didn't do? And she said that everything he'd done perfectly. Yeah, I'm like, I don't really know what we're like, then why are we even here? Like, if people are so content and so happy, we have to be willing to speak the truth. And I think we're so focused on having the perfect talking points and saying everything the exact right way, and never throwing a Democrat under the bus. It's not throwing a Democrat under the bus to say, listen, Joe Biden inherited in America after 4 years of Trump. He had a lot of work to undo, and there were some things he could have done better. And as his VP, I was excited to stand by his side, but of course I have my own ideas. I mean, when they were both running for president against one another, she was very fine, critiquing things that Joe Biden had strategized and had done before in his administration. And it was just like, she was afraid to do that, lest it be seen as throwing him under the bus. And I just think we need to have more conversation about how critique and rigorous critique is not throwing each other under the bus. It is so important to a democracy. It's how we avoid dictatorships, right? Mm-hmm. It's how we avoid allowing untested ideas to continue to harm. It's like, hey, we tested it for 4 years under Biden, and maybe he didn't know what going into it. He tried his best. We realized it didn't work. Americans are struggling financially, and I have a plan to get us out of that. And the unwillingness to say that was a problem. And even after the election, there are people in the 92%, and I voted for Kamala Harris. And there were people in the 92% of Black women who voted for Kamala Harris who will not admit that there were some missteps in her campaign. They say she ran a perfect campaign, and she did nothing wrong. And I just don't.
Perfect campaign doesn't lose.
Perfect campaigns don't lose.
All right.
I mean, we are dealing with misogyny. Yes, we are dealing with a racist America, but let's be real. Perfect campaigns would have gotten us a lot further. It wasn't close. And there are, definitely opinions on why it wasn't. And I firmly believe that there's some stuff that is not being said or some things that need to be looked into. I wish that there had been more of a fight for a recount, but ultimately it wasn't even close. Yeah. The results.
Yeah. And instead of us putting our energy on blaming Palestinians and blaming Arab Americans or blaming immigrants for not voting for her, had she received all of those votes, she still would have not won.
Yeah. And that's scary.
The focus should have been doubling down getting people who were not politically inclined, who were not voting. It required us being honest about the state of America while also, planning for the future and celebrating what we've accomplished. But the lack of nuance is not going to help us win. It's not going to create a space for imagination. And to be honest, I'm in a space where if we're not imagining a new future, we are perfectly okay with the state of the world that it currently is. And to be honest, that state of the world is scary as hell.
Right. As about to say, we need to all be concerned about the current state of the world. Yeah. And as you said, it kills political imagination when we cannot concede that there are things we could have done better. There are ways that we could have expressed more urgency. And I think that's the problem with this two-party system. It's like our only choices are bad and a little bit less bad. And we're expected to be grateful for those crumbs while people keep the status quo intact. And it's like, people are tired of that. And so people are not showing up, or people are showing up and saying, I'm willing to vote for the really crazy. I mean, there's no excuse, in my opinion, for voting for Trump. But apathy does come from a real place. I think people who are just saying, like, I'm jaded, I don't think that showing up is going to do anything. That means that this political system, for however long they've been alive, has signaled to them that their vote doesn't matter, that ultimately the same people are going to be in power, that they are having dinner with each other every night anyway. And so why should I believe that this person is trying to fight this person when they're spending the holidays together, they're sending beloved messages to one another? Like, at some point, we have to be willing to show a starker difference between the two parties. And if the Democrats are not going to do that, they're going to lose a lot of people, not necessarily to the Republican Party, but just to being a non-voter altogether. And that is one of the worst parts you can have about a democracy, is people who won't even show up to vote.
No, I agree, because again, we're not expecting every single elected official within the Democratic Party to think exactly the same. That is not what we're saying. But we are saying that there should be an opportunity for nuanced conversations, for true debate and true imagination. And then the party can rally, and then the people, the voters can, not people being selected by the hierarchy to represent a specific community, because that's how we got people like John Fetherman.
Yeah.
I'm from Pennsylvania. Okay, that's how we got Christian Sinema. And Joe Manchin. Like, that's how we got those individuals who were constantly barriers to Democrats passing really would have been historical legislation to protect Americans.
Yeah.
Those folks stood in the way of true progress and are standing in the way of true progress. And John Fetherman, I mean, I'm from Pennsylvania, and
he's so disappointing. So disappointing.
He ran as a rebel, as a progressive, like, sir, please.
Yep, 1,000,000%. It's really sad. It's really sad. I mean, we're still seeing power being built in different ways, but it's sad to see that those who have the most power and the largest platforms, the biggest microphones, aren't doing much about it. We are coming off of incredible movements like the Amazon Labor Union, like the rise of tenant organizing, like the mutual aid networks that popped up during the COVID-19 pandemic and that were providing direct resources when the government failed. The Democratic Party should have capitalized on that grassroots mobilization, on those local organizations who are building out networks and saying, how can we empower you? And unfortunately, what we had instead was the Democratic Party deciding which races mattered more to them, underinvesting in races that mattered a lot to people and ultimately would have mattered a lot to building up this electorate. And so it just all goes to make people feel like they're going to do what they want to do anyway. Like, I feel like a pawn, and we don't want people feeling like pawns in a democracy, certainly not in the party that's supposed to be representing the most marginalized.
Yeah. And the idea and the mentality of vote blue no matter who, I think, prevents us from making substantial investments on the local level. And I'm not talking about local elections. I'm talking about interns for the Democrats. I'm talking about volunteers. I'm talking about training folks. The reason why the opposition has been winning and winning well for the last few years is because they have been investing heavily in paid opportunities for staff. The current secretary, press secretary, she rolls up the ranks as an intern, right? And so vote blue matter who doesn't enable for us to make true investments, because vote blue matter who assumes that you're going to vote blue regardless of who the candidate is. And we need bright minds with bright ideas and transformative futures that it will enable for all of us to believe in a world that is different than the one we currently exist in. On that note, we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back with our lovely guest, Chelsea Miller, to talk further about this phenomenon and how we as a party can move forward. Again, you're watching On the Other Side of Change, only on the Black Star Network.
Hello, I'm Isaac Hayes III, founder and CEO of Fanbase. Listen to what I'm about to tell you. The window to invest in Fanbase is closing. We've raised over $10.6 million of our $17 million goal. That means there's room for less than 6,370 people to invest in Fanbase for the average amount. The minimum to invest in Fanbase right now is $399. That makes you an owner in Fanbase today. Go to startengine.com/fanbase to invest. Why? Because current social apps have taken advantage of users for far too long, with content suppression, shadow banning, harmful racist content, and no real tools for monetization and equity. Fanbase has over 1.4 million users and counting, allowing anyone to reach all their following and monetize their content from day one. Social media is the new TV, and whoever owns the apps that distribute that content have the opportunity to own potential billion-dollar companies. While big platforms with uncertain futures are failing to serve their users, Fanbase is stepping up to fill the gap. Don't wait until it's too late. Invest now, invest for yourself and your future. Go to startengine.com/fanbase and own the next generation of social media.
We are back on the other side of change, only on the Black Star Network, digging into voting blue no matter who and why that is not a real strategy. I'm so excited to bring up our next guest. Chelsea Miller is a sister friend to both Jamira and I. We learned so much from her. She's a co-founder of Freedom March New York, so a real boots on the ground organizer, also founder of CPM Global and an incredible social impact strategist. Welcome to the other side of change, Chelsea.
Hi, I'm so excited to be with y'all today. I feel like there's a lot for us to get into.
Oh, so much for us to get into. So much for us to get into.
We couldn't talk about imagination without having, a prominent Gen Zer on the line telling us how they are envisioning the world in an entirely different way, which I love. I think people rag on Gen Z all the time, and I'm like, why? They're saying the things, doing the things that none of us are brave enough to do.
Yeah, a lot of that stems from fear, but we know that you just have to push through that and keep applying the pressure. And a lot of the things that we say end up coming to fruition, and that's why we are in the situation we're in now. So
okay, no Thomas. Okay, we support that. So as you have noticed, both leading up to and in the aftermath of the election so far, how had Democrats. Okay, let's start that over. Chelsea, what have you noticed both leading up to and in the aftermath of the election so far as how Democrats have responded to Republicans consolidating power?
I think that what we are seeing is the trend that we've been seeing for the past few years, right? And it's the desire to try to stay in the middle, even when the middle no longer serves us. And what we have seen is that there is a deep, deep desire across the country for people to understand who our leaders are, what they believe in, and whether or not they actually stand with them. Now, the problem is that the Republican Party, between the tales that they have crafted for themselves and some of the truths that they've doubled down on, and the fears of American society that they have used to their advantage, have built and mobilized a base. And let's be even more specific. We're talking about MAGA. We're talking about Donald Trump. Because we know that the Republican Party, as it stood years ago, the revitalization that took place was because of the Trump election and the Trump movement, right? We remember the time when Republicans didn't even want to give Donald Trump the nomination. But because of the resurgence of a movement, that is what catapulted the Republican Party. The problem is that the Democratic Party is afraid of their movements. In fact, the Democratic Party has begun to believe the things and the lies that have been told about them, and they have now started to believe those lies themselves. And as a result of that, it has stagnated the party. It has stagnated our base, and it has led to what you all were talking about earlier, right? This sense of essentially just the disillusionment for so many Democratic voters who were like, we were ready to show up and do the work. We were ready to get behind the Democratic Party. We were looking for our movements. And every single time we tried to bring the energy of a movement, y'all said, simmer down. We're going to try to stay in the middle. And so now look what the middle got us. This is where we are.
Yeah. Whoo, wow. You just said
with our knees ashy. That's what it got us.
No, but for real. And you just said such an important word, especially I want to pull out what you said as far as the Democratic Party is afraid of their movements, the movements on the left. And what's interesting is they're looking over at the Republican Party like the grass is greener. And instead of saying, oh, they are empowering and emboldening their grassroots movement, let's do the same with our movement. The Democratic Party moderates are just trying to latch on to the Republicans movement instead of owning up to who we are. It's like this fear of organizing. And it's so odd that it's happening in this way. So I'm really curious, and also just they're just pulling a lot of Republican playbooks, like being single-minded, supporting the party, even when they disagree ideologically. What's the danger in Democrats trying to play a Republican's game? And what would be more strategic?
I would say that the Democratic Party needs to remember who they are. And I think that we are looking at the Republican Party and saying, as of right now, today, the Democrats are spending so much time focusing on what the Republicans are doing. But the reality is that the Republicans took the Democratic playbook. Mm-hmm. They took the playbook of how to move and organize. They took the playbook of how to latch on to the hopes and dreams of a population that is marginalized and feels decentered from the narrative. Mm-hmm. And so they took everything that was the Democratic playbook and they flipped it to say, actually, no, it is the average white man who is the most in danger in our current society. Right? It is the average white man who DEI is in fact oppressing. Right? And so now it's kind of like the flip and the reverse of now they are trying to recategorize who was oppressed in America. Right. And so it's interesting because I think now what we are seeing is this push of, we are afraid of liberals and the left becoming the majority. And so we need to make sure that we have, the population to maintain control and all these things. And so all that to say that I think that realistically speaking, the Democratic Party needs to remember who they are and who they are responsible to. And I also think that there's something to be said about realizing that playbooks are meant to be drafted, ran, and when it does not work, you rewrite it. You don't do the same thing over and over again. And you don't sit and wait for your opposition to figure out what your game plan is and then have them run with it. That's when you bring in a new coach. That's when you start leading differently. That's when you bring in new players. And so I think for us going into the next 4 years and beyond, the question is whether or not we are going to stop relying on the way that things used to be. We're going to stop relying on traditional pathways through institutions, because that is not the only way that we can create change and effectively lead. That also requires us to show up and be in community. That requires us to listen and stop fearing young people on the front lines. Stop fearing Black women showing up and leading and saying how we're supposed to do it and why and the tone of our voices, but really think about the way that you want to propel a vision. And I think that the moment that we stop hyper-focusing on MAGA and Trump and Project 2025 and all of these things, because all of that is doing is allowing us to be reactive, when now is the time for us to start building out a plan.
Yeah, it's so I'm so happy you flagged that in regards to the idea that plans are meant to be changed, right? If the times change, we have to have a plan to meet the moment. And the idea that you have Republicans and their opposition planning for Project 2025 for years, and there is no equivalent plan on the Democratic side, it just goes to show you the lack of preparation. But also, as someone like you, Chelsea, who have really organized folks in community, but also in the C-suite, what do you think the discrepancy is when the Democratic Party say vote blue no matter who, with the recognition that there are actually young people who are ready to lead if they were given the opportunity and the resources to do so?
I would say that the discrepancy is something that we saw coming, and we knew that it would hurt. And we knew that if not addressed, that this would be where we are. And so being on the front lines and seeing the movement and coming in, I mean, Freedom March NYC was birthed in the midst of the George Floyd uprising. And so when we were on the front lines and also in the midst of a global pandemic, we saw already that institutions do not always work. We saw already that the only time that these things are effective is when there is a status quo. But the minute that that status quo is challenged or there is a fracture in it, people are going to go where they feel most safe, and that is always going to be in community. And so if you do not have a direct plan to engage with people in real time, right? When we were on the front lines organizing, nobody cared about where you went to school. Nobody cared about what job you had. People just wanted to make sure that you had their back and that you would help to make sure they got home.
Yeah.
And you believe the same things that they believed, and you saw them as human. We forgot the importance of showing people that we stand with them as a Democratic Party. And when you decide that there's nothing that you will stand for, then you will fall for anything. And what we saw with this past presidential election, and what we are seeing now play out all across the country, is that the Democratic Party and Democratic candidates and Democratic races all across this country are falling for anything. When you don't have a clear plan, then you're making dinners with the opposition. When you don't have a clear plan, then you are showing up and only half of your members are on the same page of what's going to happen at a presidential address. When you don't have a clear plan, then some folks are getting votes in their districts, and then other places are seeing a red wave. When you don't have a clear plan, then you don't even know how to communicate to your base. How can your base even trust you with the direction that they're supposed to be headed in if even leadership is unclear of what that looks like? When you don't have a clear plan, the only thing that's going to be your talking points is Trump, instead of bringing it back to what the American promise is and what people need right now to feel safe.
Yeah.
Couldn't have said it better.
And let's call a spade a spade. Let's name the things. And I think that's also one of the biggest frustrations that we've seen with the Democratic Party is the communication crisis. No one is naming it and saying what it is. And we are assuming that somehow people are not intelligent or uninformed, as though we're not living in a digital age where everyone has access to a phone. And so we'd rather blame the technology instead of blaming the conditions. We'd rather say it's an issue with the algorithm instead of saying what is feeding the algorithm. Real-time crisis, real-time mismanagement of promises and trust and policy and foreign affairs. But it's easier for us to say the problem is coming from outside the house. Well, what's happening inside the house? And I said, and I even said this on stage last year before the election at a democracy convention, when everyone on stage was saying, you know, the problem with this generation is the fact that they're anti-democratic and all of these things. And I said, well, the way that we define what it looks like to be democratic, the way that it's traditionally defined may be different from how young people understand that. If you go into communities and you ask young people how many of them participate in mutual aid or bring out mutual aid efforts, you'd be surprised at those numbers. If you ask them how many people are showing up and creating third spaces for community and belonging to begin having these conversations, you're going to see overwhelmingly how many young people are showing up to do that. Now, if the only metric that you're using to see if young people are engaged is based on civic leadership and how many of them show up to a school board meeting, then you are going to be sorely disappointed. And so it's time for us to start meeting folks where they are and understanding the places where they are going to build community. It's also time for us to realize that if we do not reckon with our history and acknowledge what is taking place instead of avoiding it and then start calling it different things, oh, it's the algorithm. No, it's not the algorithm, it's America. So it's time for us to start unpacking and unseating that. And if we are not willing to, then as we know, the chickens are going to come home to roost.
Roost.
They're not laying eggs, but they'll come home to roost.
Woo!
Yes, Chelsea. Come on, girl. I just love what you said. And I think it's so important to say. And also, there used to be a time when the Democratic Party did have those different metrics where someone like a John Lewis could be desegregating through civil disobedience, technically breaking the law, and that be valued, and then him become a tenured legacy member of Congress. And now it's like the party is being ran by older white, strategists and consultants who have no idea what the people need. How can the party go back to being a true voice for the people? And are there Democrats who you think are doing this well, who you want to highlight?
I am going to hold my flowers because we still have a long way to go. But this is what, because listen, I'm expecting a lot, and we all need a lot. And right now, I don't think it's the time to give roses just because we are in the midst of a crisis.
Yeah.
And I think that the reality is that there is so much more that needs to be done. And Americans are hurting. And a lot of this stems from that, right? From a historical standpoint of racial division that hasn't been healed. Now we have critical race theory. We have books being banned. We have all of these things that are happening across our country that is creating this divisiveness that is not new to this generation. On top of that, we have a party that right now is being fueled by who has the greatest dollars. When, as we know, what wins elections, of course, is going to be money, but it's going to be people. It is going to be people showing up and believing in something. And so I am waiting to see who is going to show the Democratic base, the left, liberals, folks in the middle, people who want to vote but don't know who to vote for, swing voters, who is going to stand for something clearly and the most defined so that we can get the energy and the fuel back to show that we clearly are ready to be in the game. Because as of right now, we're not.
Yeah. Which is truly disappointing. Okay, last question that we have for you, Chelsea, is in the meantime, what is the best the best way for people to work within the current systems that will enable for us to strengthen the advocacy that we all need in order to get us to the place that is going to allow all of us to be free?
We love this question because we're putting the power back into the hands of the people. So I would say that the best way to do that is to organize. And I was just on a call this week and I was saying this. Organizing does not solely have to be being on the front lines and marching. If that is your calling, then you go and do that. I'll also speak about marching a little bit. But the greatest thing that you can do is be clear on what your plan is and bring like-minded people together to execute on that. Some of the greatest movements within our country did not happen on social media. It is a tool, but it cannot be the only tool. And so it is important for us to begin building our communities back with relational organizing, knowing who your neighbors are, starting to have those conversations on it, even if it's on a local level, because we know that you can build models for success on a local level. Not everything has to be, how can we get the millions to be on the same page? Sometimes it's the few thousand that are in your community, just like in Freedom Summer. Okay, they weren't out here posting on social media. They didn't have social media in 1964. Okay, it was a couple hundred college students that went down to Mississippi to partner with local leaders to organize to get Mississippi Black folks to go and vote and have their rights. And because of that, that's what led to the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, all the things that were passed. A few young people who showed up, went to go and live in community with each other, were writing letters home to their parents. And because of that, that completely shifted the landscape of America as we know it. And now we see those things being rolled back on. The second thing that I will say is that it is time for us to ask ourselves, because marching was something that was seen as radical in the 60s. There's a reason as to why they marched, because around that time, even within that generation, it was illegal to even be able to congregate. It was illegal to be able to even know how to read and write, to even be able to spell your own name. And so when you saw thousands, tens of thousands, millions of people coming outside and showing up for something, that was radical. We are in 2025 where we have marched before. The blueprint has been set for that. What is our blueprint for 2025 and beyond that is going to be just as transformative, just as disruptive as a march? not a march, just as disruptive as one. And I think once we start asking ourselves those very serious questions, that is when we will get to a point where in the next 50, 60 years, we can say that we've done our jobs and give ourselves some roses.
Yes.
Love it. Well, we thank you so much for participating in this episode. Tell the folks how they can stay in contact with you.
Stay in contact with me at the Chelsea Miller on Instagram, and I'm always up to something, whether that be producing a docuseries or organizing some initiative or being in community. I am outside, so definitely get involved.
No, we are
the big one, not the little one.
Yeah, and one of the few people that isn't just like yapping for yapping's sake, but actually putting work, her words into work and actually producing real tangible change that is going to impact communities. And she's done that already. So we truly appreciate you being a guest on this show, and we look forward to having you back at a later date. With that being said, this is The Other Side of Change. We're going to take a quick break, and this is the Black Star Network.
Hello, I'm Isaac Hayes III, founder and CEO of Fanbase. Listen to what I'm about to tell you. The window to invest in Fanbase is closing. We've raised over $10.6 million of our $17 million goal. That means there's room for less than 6,370 people to invest in Fanbase for the average amount. The minimum to invest in Fanbase right now is $399. That makes you an owner in Fanbase today. Go to startengine.com/fanbase to invest. Why? Because current social apps have taken advantage of users for far too long, with content suppression, shadow banning, harmful racist content, and no real tools for monetization and equity. Fanbase has over 1.4 million users and counting, allowing anyone to reach all their following and monetize their content from day one. Social media is the new TV, and whoever owns the apps that distribute that content have the opportunity to own potential billion-dollar companies. While big platforms with uncertain futures are failing to serve their users, Fanbase is stepping up to fill the gap. Don't wait until it's too late. Invest now, invest for yourself and your future. Go to startengine.com/fanbase and own the next generation of social media.
We are back with The Other Side of Change, only on the Black Star Network. Joining us now is my good sis, Alliyah Logan. Alliyah is one of the youngest consultants at UNICEF and is the co-founder of Cultivate Global Education, where she's championing a better world through quality education, which we need now more than ever, as we said. She was also just featured on Forbes 30 Under 30 for her work in education and has met with world leaders from over 25 countries. How lucky are we to have her? Welcome to The Other Side of Change.
How lucky am I to be here? Come on. You guys are so brilliant. Congratulations on this fantastic podcast. I've been tuning in and it's so amazing.
Thank you. We appreciate you so much. And we're truly so glad that you're here. We need your voice. As you can tell, we were just talking about all that's going wrong and you have a really important perspective. So, yeah.
Absolutely. I think it's absolutely so concerning to see what is happening with education globally. And for all of the users and people listening today, you should be extremely concerned to see the current state of education and the abrupt changes that are being proposed in just 3 months during the Trump administration. Just imagine where we'll be at by 2028 if people don't pay attention. And I think the points that you all made were so extremely important to really factor in on what's actually happening, what's happening in schools, what's happening in local districts, and how people are actually being impacted by these decisions that are not about students' well-being. It's not about improving education. Rather, it's about monetary gain and how much money politicians and people can make off of students and off of students working instead of being in classrooms. So it's extremely disheartening. And the Department of Education is extremely important. They really make sure that students who either have physical disabilities, learning disabilities, whatever the case may be, that they're protected in schools, and there's jurisdiction and implementation of civil rights and civil law within classrooms all across the country. So it's very alarming that we've seen book bans. We've seen rhetoric that children should be working instead of being in classrooms, and that they're going to support the economy, and that if they're receiving free or reduced lunch, they're actually cutting corners. There's so much rhetoric that has been seen throughout the nation that is false, and it doesn't support young people in any way. And I think one of my main concerns is with young people who are already being impacted by this, who live in the worst states when it comes to pre-K through 12 public school education, like New Mexico, Oklahoma, Alabama, Nevada, Mississippi, just a few to name, who are already struggling. What would these cuts and federal cuts do to their classroom environment, do to their education, and with enrollment from pre-K to 12? And I think looking back on COVID-19 and school closures, that had such a tremendous impact and exacerbated the already failing education system in the United States. But now that those young people are in elementary school or in middle school or going on to high school, seeing these cuts further just shows that this generation and the current generation enrolled in pre-K through 12 are being failed. And it is very alarming to see that their education is being attacked in unprecedented ways.
Yeah. You know, Alliyah, historically, we know that education in America prior to Black folks integrating into white schools was high quality education. We also know that college used to be free before Black folks started integrating into those universities. And as all of us are Black women, you know, I think it would be remiss of me to not mention, you know, that Black women are currently one of the fastest growing, highly educated women, highly educated people in the United States. Tell us a little bit more of how education has led you to this work and why it has been important to your own life and why you continue to advocate for it, both on the local and international level.
Absolutely. I think education to me has always been so important. Education is elevation. And as you all mentioned prior to, when a group of people is uneducated, it's so easy to control them. When they aren't educated on their culture or historical backgrounds, it's easier to be sold propaganda and lies. So for me, I actually started my education work in New York State, where I saw that with the American Civil Liberties Union and the New York Civil Liberties Union, where I saw that in New York, even within the United States, a country that has such a high GDP and such a which should have such a great education system, that there were still failing aspects throughout each state, and specifically in my home state. So I really advocated to dismantle the school to prison pipeline. And I looked a lot at punitive measures that actually impacted Black girls and Native girls and Black boys the most when it comes to suspension rates and at a disproportionate rate. So I looked at that specifically and said, you know, what is going on in public school education where young people are facing punitive measures instead of restorative justice practices. And then from there, I really started having conversation with girls internationally, realizing that this was an issue that was occurring in almost every country and every region of the world, where girls were being impacted in different ways by punitive measures or lack of resources or lack of investment. And I really wanted to advocate to say, how can we convince world leaders? How can we convince people regionally to invest in education, not just because it's important for them to do that, and they should do that, but then also convincing them and saying, well, you're actually going to be improving your country's GDP per capita. You're going to be improving your economy by investing in girls and investing in education. And it's so sad that you have to put a monetary value on education to convince people to educate young people, but it's the reality of the world that we live in. And of course, there should be efforts to reimagine education in a way that is productive, where students' voices are at the forefront of every decision made, and we really promote positive learning experiences. And like you mentioned, those stats with Black women and Black girls being the highest rate of people being educated within this country, it is unfortunate to now see that there are this rhetoric and appeal to trying to remove like Department of Education and dismantling education as itself, because we know how dangerous that can be.
Yeah. Ooh, you said so much important things just now. But what I really loved is that you talked about how education is supposed to be student centered. And right now we're seeing anything but. It's very focused on what the adults in the room are most comfortable with, what the parents, what the elected officials, but like, what about students and young people? And you brought up briefly before what's happening in different states, but yeah, what are you hearing from students about what they're thinking about, the state of education right now, especially in those states like Florida and Texas, or southern states, which are not predominantly white states. Like most Black people in America live in the South still. 55% of Black Americans live in the South. So we are also there too. But yeah, what are you hearing from young people there?
Students are just so concerned, and it's extremely disheartening to see that, so many young people who, again, were in their education during COVID-19 are now facing these impacts where it's the possibility of losing funding, the little funding that they even received from the federal government, and the little funding that they had from their state government and on a local level. So students are extremely disheartened. And I think that we're in a time where there's so much misinformation being spread, but within that, because of social media, we're really able to share information widely and reach a wide audience of people. And my concern is that with this administration, the plan is to make sure that, so many headlines are coming out, you're not paying attention to what's actually going on, and then you're ignoring policies that are happening. But I think young people have been extremely engaged from all sides of the political spectrum and from many different backgrounds with advocating for education and advocating for their education. And for me, I'm so concerned about students living with physical disabilities or learning disabilities, those living below the poverty line. 2.5 million children throughout America experience homelessness annually, and schools are a safe haven for them, whether it's accessing free and reduced lunch, having a safe place, having community. This is something that is extremely vital to every young person's life, to have a fundamental place to be able to learn. And I think even with students who are undocumented, those in the foster care system, those whose parents are not engaged, this is a very alarming and hard time. I mean, even the education secretary now, she said she wants to return authority over education to the states and to local communities, and to allow parents to be in control. But the unfortunate reality is, for students who don't have that family unit, for students who don't have a community to depend on, they're going to fall through the cracks. And there's no support for them. And this is the purpose of the Department of Education, is to ensure that no matter your zip code, no matter your background, your financial background either, that you're able to have a strong and basic education. And I would argue within my work, I've been advocating to have an equitable education, which is one of the words that are that have been banned, that you can't say anymore, that it's way too woke to say equitable now. But it is important to have equitable education and to ensure that every student has the resources that they need as an individual and as a larger collective to succeed.
Yeah. It feels like a very full circle moment, because attacks on education have always gone hand in hand with authoritarian politics. How do we fight back? From your perspective, as someone who has been a youth advocate for so long, who has worked on both the domestic and international level, how do we fight back, especially when those attacks are happening, not just, as a cultural war, but also on the policy level?
Absolutely. I think we fight back in such different ways. I've been extremely impressed by the ways that people have been fighting back, whether it's students, whether it's people, lawyers or attorneys, whether it's larger organizations, have really been advocating for education and fighting back against any of the administration's attempt to essentially make sure that people are uneducated and destroy history and make sure you forget history and historical things that have happened throughout this country and throughout the world. So I've seen people who have online links to different books that have been proposed to be banned in different counties and in different states. I've seen people who have started GoFundMes for education and for books and for resources. And I've seen a lot of community. And I think that's something that is so important. When you see these headlines, it's just a human nature to feel like as an individual, you can't change anything. And as an individual, it is easy to feel helpless. But when you're in a collective and as a community, you're really able to see the power that people have. And I think it's really up to the American people to stand up and say, we're not going to have this. We can't allow these things to happen. And although they seem small, they all add up. When you're looking at like child labor laws and proposing to have children working instead of being in schools, these are all very, very smart and calculated attacks on education. And I think there's a rhetoric that, this current administration is uneducated or that they don't know what they're doing. And I think that is very alarming to think. They're very calculated and they know the steps that they need to take to ensure that people around the country, especially Black people, stay uneducated and remain living under the poverty line or those who do live under the poverty line. So it's very important to stay organized. And I think what I've learned working internationally is that there's so much more power in numbers and understanding that we should be advocating for things together instead of as an individual. So I've really seen so many different people around the world advocating for funding, for spaces for students, gender transformative education curriculum to be implemented in their states and in their schools. And I have even seen and worked with organizations like the XQ Institute. And they're so fantastic. And you guys should research them. They do advocacy and just rethinking the high school experiences. So there's organizations, there are people out there that are doing the work. It's really about continuing momentum and not feeling helpless, like feeling that you are on your own, where rather you should be feeling more energized to be involved in different and various ways. But I've been extremely impressed to see how people have been really engaged. And it's hard to be positive during this time, but it is important to say that, we have to stay focused. We have to advocate for education because we know what works and we know what doesn't work. What doesn't work is what's currently happening and what has been happening throughout this country. And what we need to do is really reimagine education where students' well-being and interest and educations are at the forefront of all decisions.
So true. And shout out to XQ Institute. They have a really great documentary called The First Class, which people can watch online for free. And it talks about some of the ways that they're reinventing high school education, making it more interactive, more innovative, encouraging students to ask questions and to not purport that there's a right or a wrong answer, but there's a story that we've unveiled and a truth from history, but also there's ways that we are making history each day. So definitely love that shout out. Also, I appreciate you talking about your international work. And I am curious how these attacks are shaping international perspective on the US, because we are global citizens. And so what we do affects other people, but also it affects how we are looked at by other people. So you're doing a lot of work internationally. What is the conversation with some of the folks that you're working with on that global scale when they see what's happening in the US?
I think it's humiliating. It's sad to see that the United States has taken such a complete 180 on the highway at that when it comes to human rights, civil rights, and even investments in different organizations and investments in humanitarian aid, like with the defunding of USAID and the impact that has had globally. I think America and the current administration can't just come in and say, we're not going to do this anymore if we for decades have been supporting humanitarian aid and was supposedly the forefront of democracy and like human rights and well-being. I think it's embarrassing to say the least. And I think other countries are noticing and witnessing that the United States is falling behind when it comes to its promises of being a beacon of hope for people internationally. And I think, unfortunately, it's setting an example of the wrong things to do when it comes to human rights, education, girls' rights in those instances. And there's so many countries around the world that are unfortunately also failing with education. I've seen the recent attacks for just girls' livelihood in Afghanistan, which is so unfortunate to see. But it is even worse when the United States isn't setting a proper example of what human rights and humanitarian law should look like within a country. So it's been a difficult time, but even within that, there's so many Americans who have continued to reiterate the importance of having various aid being given to countries around the world, having Americans have access to human rights. And I think it's difficult because in the United States, there's always this push to focus more on civil rights and civil liberties than looking at human rights. So America has always been engaged with different organizations like the United Nations, but has repeatedly failed, and it hasn't even ratified the Convention of the Status of the Rights of the Child. So there's so many instances where the United States could improve itself and could ensure that it is going on the right track. But with this administration, we're taking complete 180. But it is powerful to see how people around the world are advocating for people within the United States and how that could impact children everywhere and globally. And I think it's so powerful to see how people have been giving advice for their experiences living under dictatorships, living under regimes, and what they've done and organized and how they've fought back against political attacks and that we're unfortunately seeing throughout the United States. So it is so important to really stay educated and really stay engaged in what's happening internationally and seeing what Americans can do to ensure that our country doesn't go down the wrong path that is currently going down.
Yeah, and I think it's really important. I'm really happy you talked about like humanitarian aid, because I think when this whole idea of America's first, that we should only focus on ourselves, forget what's happening around the world, totally negates the fact that humanitarian aid is not just a nice thing to do, but it's actually politically a safe thing to do. It helps to ensure that there is stability and prosperity around the world. So it's less likely for folks to engage in violent activities or to join militias. And so by doing humanitarian aid actually makes us safer. And also recognizing that there are many communities around the world where children and families are victims of environmental causes, right? So they are refugees because of their communities being devastated. And so by providing humanitarian aid actually prevents less immigrants from coming to the United States, as many of those folks would be the same ones that say we have way too many immigrants. So I think folks need to, which is one of the reasons why they want to keep you uneducated, because if they're keeping you uneducated, you don't really see the connections of how our lives are so intertwined with those around the world that we can't separate ourselves from the tyranny or the displacement or the violence that is occurring elsewhere without also seeing how that is deeply impacted to what happens here to us every single day.
Exactly.
Preach, preach, preach.
So tell folks where they can stay connected to you and where they can find out more information about the work you're doing.
Absolutely. You guys can follow me on Instagram, stay closely engaged. And before I go, I wanted to read a quote by Paulo Freire. He's a Brazilian activist. And during the time of his activism, the similar things that were happening in the United States were happening in Brazil, where there was a tax on education. People living in poverty couldn't go to school. And I think it's so important for us to stay educated and to also ensure that we're looking at different leaders from around the world and throughout history who have faced similar struggles that we're currently facing and what they've done. He said, take this. He says, knowledge emerges only through invention and reinvention, through the restless, impatient, continuing, hopeful inquiry human beings pursue in the world, and with each other. And I think that is just such an amazing point that I really want to end off on is we have to stay connected. We have to be connected and really understand that there is more similarities and differences between all of us. So I really encourage you all, to stay connected, stay involved with so many different education work, continue listening to this podcast, and then you can find me on Instagram and on LinkedIn. No longer on Twitter or X, but on there.
Our own little form of resistance. We appreciate you, girl. I'm barely on there myself. I deleted the app from my phone. I would have to log in through the browser or something.
Yeah, for sure.
But yeah. We appreciate you, Alliyah. Thank you so much. Y'all follow our girl.
And we'll be right back after this break. You are watching The Other Side of Change only on the Black Star Network.
What's up, y'all? Look, Fanbase is more than a platform. It's a movement to empower creators, offering a unique opportunity for everyday people to invest in Black-owned tech, infrastructure, and help shape the future of social media. Investing in technology is essential for creating long-term wealth and influence in the digital age. The Black community must not only consume tech, We must own it.
Discover how equity crowdfunding can serve as a powerful tool for funding Black businesses, allowing entrepreneurs to raise capital directly through their community through the Jobs Act.
Welcome back to The Other Side of Change. As always, y'all know the conversation is far from over, but we hope this episode helped you to clarify the stakes in the fight ahead when it comes to protecting education and our young people.
If you want to dive deeper, check out Original Sins by Eve Inwing and Schoolhouse Burning by Derek Black. You can also follow people like Alliyah Logan, who was our guest a few moments ago, and groups like PEN America, We Need Diverse Books, and the African American Policy Forum.
And as always, stay engaged, know your rights, organize, hold your representatives accountable. As Alliyah said, we have to stay organized. As Jamira said, every small action scaffolds up to something bigger. And until next time, keep pushing for a just future.
Yeah, we'll see you soon.